Right, well, welcome to Telsig. This is, as always, Phil Martin from the University of York. I'm joined today by Mike Ed.D and Paulina Melichova in the studio. So really great to have you both here. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you.
I'm happy to be here. Thank you for inviting me.
So we're recording this off the back of a couple of really interesting training sessions that Mike, you spearheaded. These talks will be linked to in the show notes, and they acted as a really great staff training session for introducing the concepts of AI, how they affect education, how they affect assessment. And one of the things I really liked about your presentation of these was that it was pitched almost immaculately. There's so many training sessions out there at the moment, and the way that you gave enough background into generative AI because of your background as a computer scientist to a general audience and really kind of picked on the useful stuff that was great for people to know, that filled in some gaps and enabled us to then jump in and talk more knowledgeably about assessment, I thought was great. Thank you for those. And as I say, we will link to those on there. So if we get into any more technical topics, these will be fleshed out in full on the videos. But let's just do some intros first of all. So Mike, can we start with your background, your role here, and how you got interested in this topic of AI literacies?
Well, my background is in computer science. Before I came here to York, I was York St John, and prior to then Hull, but I've also taught in places like Beijing University of Technology in China and Waikato Institute of Technology in New Zealand. So I've had a reasonably checkered background before I came here, and I'm a late academic as well. I spent some time in industry, and that perhaps reflects in my interest more in applying technology rather than being a pure rich computer scientist.
Yeah, so your background is computer science, but you introduced the talks that you gave as someone who's now sort of research active in AI literacies. Is that right?
Yes, I'm a teaching and scholarship lecturer. However, I've always been interested in doing research on the side, and generative AI for me was an area where it perhaps expanded beyond pure computer science. Generative AI made AI accessible to people who were not STEM, who were not specialist. All of a sudden, we saw Gen AI being used for applications which we'd not really thought before, because other people from disciplines outside of science think about the technology and use it in different ways. I found that very, very interesting, and that's really piqued my interest, and that's why I developed my research in that area. And I suppose that's why I worked well with people from outside of the discipline, because a lot of the ideas that are coming and a lot of the things that I'm reading are from outside computer science.
Would you spend most of your time now on the education side of computer science, or are you still involved in computer science research?
No, I've been long interested in computer science education. So prior to Gen AI, my interest in Gen AI, I was interested in why females don't study computer science. And before that, more in the sort of the application of ed tech into teaching and learning in computer science. So that's always been my interest. That's always been an area that has been the focus of my research activity or my scholarship activity.
All right, thanks, Mike. Paulina, over to you. It was really great to sit next to you in this talk, because we were listening to someone talk about computer science and an audience member who's firmly in the skills development side of things here at York. So can you give us a bit about your background? What do you do on a daily basis, and tell us a bit about your role and academic interests?
Yeah, sure, with pleasure. So firstly, I would just like to cheer Mike on with the, it's great to hear that you tried, you researched the gender equality within your area. That's always great to hear. Yeah, so my name is Paulina, and I am an associate lecturer in skills development. So my background is in teaching English as a foreign language, and I have been working at a variety of universities within the UK for the past few years, most recently at York. And I am based in the School for Business and Society, and I work mostly with postgraduate students, many of whom come from abroad, and they come here to do their masters. So my approach is very much student-centered. I am me and my colleagues are the canaries in the coal mine, I guess you could say, because we meet with students practically on a daily basis, and we have much closer contact with them than many lecturers or tutors have. And it is our role to support the subject delivery with academic and communication skills. So it has been really interesting to see student reactions to AI and try to integrate that into other skills that the students need in order to pass their degrees and to improve their employability.
Yeah. So with student skills firmly in mind, I'd like to get an idea from both of you as to what you think are the main academic skills that students need. We do find ourselves kind of at the moment where we're reevaluating what are we teaching students, how are we assessing them, and what the skills that we're trying to develop in students. So I'll just, Mike, fire this one back at you. How do you see this at the moment? What do you look for in your students? And by extension, what skills should staff have?
I think mainly the skills that we're looking for in our students are unchanged to what they've been in the past. We're looking for students who can operate at the higher ends of Bloom's taxonomy. So we're looking for analysis, evaluation, creativity, synthesis. That's what our graduates should be, sort of the level that they should be working at and the level that we should be aiming to get them to. Gen AI has come along and it's changed the landscape. It can do a lot of the lower order, the remembering knowledge that was an important part of perhaps school and certainly the early years of an undergraduate degree. Gen AI suddenly is almost, maybe I'm pushing the point a bit, but almost rendered it redundant. Gen AI, I've heard some people say Gen AI will become soon our content expert. So in terms of what our students need, I don't think they need anything more in terms of what we're aiming to get them to, but they do need tools. They do need to understand the tools. And one of the key tools that we're seeing now is Gen AI. So it is just a tool, but our students need to learn how to work with it effectively and, most importantly, ethically, because there are a series of ethical implications of misuse with these tools, just like many other tools. But with Gen AI, it is easier to misuse them intentionally and unintentionally. So the last bit you ask, what do staff need? Well, staff need to understand these tools and they need to understand the implications of how to teach our students to use them effectively. They also need to understand what kind of misuses there are, and we need to be aware of that, and we need to change our perception of how students use this.
Right, so actually maybe it would be helpful at this stage just to give us your definition of generative AI as a computer science with the alacrity that you gave in the talk the other day. No pressure.
Well, I'll try and remember what I said, but essentially Gen AI is just a particular type of AI. If we go back through the history of AI, it started off with what I call hard-coded AI, things like expert systems. And what AI did then was it produced a search, intelligent searching to go through a database or data. And that data originally was hard-coded. Then we moved on to that data being able to be input by our users. And still the AI was relatively straightforward. It was searching. So we were searching through data to optimize things like the traveling salesman problem, where what's the best way to create a route between lots of different destinations. And from that, then it moved on really to machine learning, which is what I think most of us think of, classical machine learning, where we have large amounts of data and we're able to do three things with that. We're able to cluster it, we're able to categorize it, and we're able to predict it. So depending on the data that we had, clustering is agglomerating similar records together. Categorization is when you have a category and you're predicting what kind of category the data will be. And then regression is predicting the value. So we have that. And then the next thing was neural networks. So neural networks then basically did that, but they did that much more efficiently, but they were less transparent than our classical machine learning. With classical machine learning, most of the time we know exactly what the algorithm's doing. With neural networks, it's much, much harder. And now the newest generation is large language models, which are a type of neural network, but they're focused more on textual data, whereas prior to that, most of the focus was on numeric data. And so large language models now have huge amounts of data, far bigger than we probably would have envisaged 15 years ago. And what they are doing now is they are predicting, using probability, an outcome. And that outcome is normally textual. The downside of that is that it's incredibly difficult to see how they've arrived at the value or the output. And that's where we get things like hallucinations and bias. We don't really know how that's occurred, but it has occurred.
Paulina, so if I just to reiterate the point a bit to Mike, so what are the kind of academic skills? Mike's saying that they haven't really changed, that we're still looking at these higher order thinking skills, but the tools that we're using to develop these have changed, and the tools that students are using have changed. How does it look like from your vantage point when you're helping students develop these skills? What do you see as the primary skills that they need?
Yeah, that's a really important question. And I'll just repeat that most of the students I work with are master's students. And with those, I would really agree with Mike. There is no substitute for analytical and critical and evaluative skills. And that is ultimately what the whole delivery of a program at a university is trying to achieve, along with, skills like problem solving, the ability to communicate in a variety of formats with a range of different audiences. What I have seen with my students is that they can be very resourceful in using AI to perhaps decrease the effort a task takes or make a certain task less time-consuming. But with many students, the critical and evaluative skills you need to judge whether something that AI has produced for you is valid or relevant or objective are the exact same skills that you need to evaluate anything else that has been produced, let's say, by people. And the students do lack those skills. I think one of the danger of generative AI is when people see it as more than the tool that it actually is, like Mike said. I feel that with generative AI, you almost need to use your critical thinking more than with other tools because you can get so much more information so fast. And unless we equip our students with the ability to spot bias, to recognize evidence that isn't based in reality or high quality, all those things that we normally teach on the degrees, unless we teach the students this, generative AI has, I think, the potential to do more harm to them than good at this point.
Yeah, and I think that when we talk about the skills that students need, I guess, yes, you're correct. The skills haven't changed. If anything, they've become more important with the awareness of the potential for misinformation, critical thinking, understanding where your information comes from and everything is more important than ever.
Absolutely.
But we have this slightly more complex situation where we do, I think the conversation is around the skills that are needed to use these tools. So yes, those fundamental cognitive skills haven't changed and their requirement is and hopefully will always be important. But there's a conversation to be had around how much of our responsibility is it to not train students directly. I guess that's the wrong word because a lot of people involved in this, and unless we're with Mike's background, we find ourselves slightly floundering in trying to teach how to use generative AI when most of us are learning how to use it ourselves. But that we feel there's a responsibility to set the conditions where students can learn how to use generative AI responsibly in a way that does all the things that you're talking about. So is that's the thing that I'm quite interested in getting to the core of. How much space do you see that as having to take up in our curriculum? How much energy should we be putting into it? And where should we be trying to get the students to in terms of their awareness and base level proficiency with these tools?
I think over the last 15, 20 years or so, there's been a big focus at university level on digital literacy. And that's reflected really what's been happening in industry. We've had, I think in business, they call it Industry 4.0, which is the technology enhanced industry, technology enhanced working. Now we're moving towards Industry 5, which is human AI collaboration, human technology collaboration, working as the hybrid human AI. And that brings us then back to the skills that our students need for being able to operate in this new industrial environment. And what the students need really, I think, is what we've termed AI literacy, which is similar to digital literacy in many ways, but also distinct. It's AI literacy because we do need to teach them how to use the AI tools, the most accessible of which is Gen AI. But in the future, they will be using other AI tools such as robotics and perhaps even new disruptive technologies such as things like neural computer interfaces and things like that. So it's not just AI or not just Gen AI, but it's AI in particular, or these new disruptive technologies that we need to teach our students how to work with. And AI literacy needs to cover first the use of these tools, second the ethical use of these tools as well, not just within education, but within society too, because we've seen with many technologies how they can be used and misused, as well as working within universities too. So quite rightly, when Gen AI first came, the focus was on assessment and the impact on assessment. I think we're getting there now. We have to change. So we're getting there. When I say we're getting there, we're understanding what the implications of Gen AI are on our assessments. We're not quite there in terms of adapting our assessments to cope with the use of the tools by students. And AI literacy needs to focus on those things, using the tools, the ethics of it, the impact of these tools. That's my opinion anyway.
Yeah, I resonate pretty much with what Mike said. I think we're very fortunate to have Mike doing the series of workshops at our university for staff. I think before we can think about where to take the students with AI, we need to address the staff knowledge gap. I think like in so many other institutions and perhaps industries where AI is making inroads, some of us are burying our heads in the sand. Some of us are already overwhelmed with other things. Others try to embrace AI, try to learn perhaps on our own or with some of the resources that are available online. I think what is really important before we get into other areas of this debate would be perhaps ideally a whole sector understanding of a charter in terms of the ethical implications, what happens with assessment, and discussing, debating what even a proficiency level or perhaps a basic level of AI literacy would look like. So I think these are really important questions to answer. I think specifically in my practice, I would say that at the moment, there isn't a lot of perhaps agreement or clear direction about how to use AI or whether to use it. For me personally, I have started to embrace AI as part of my coaching business. I can see definite advantages, and I think what I'm aiming at the moment is to introduce AI as a tool, just like we use laptops or calculators. Introduce it as something that is there, it's not going to go away, and it's flawed and it has its limitations, but it can be very useful. So for example, with my students, many of whom don't have English as their first language, it can be really helpful to use AI for them to simplify some of the academic language that they encounter in academic texts and perhaps use translation tools a bit less. So I can definitely see huge benefits that this could bring to our students. But I think you're really right in asking the question about actually how much space should AI take in curriculum and how much energy we should dedicate to this, because it can just feel like another thing that we're adding to an already really packed workload. And I think the senior management really needs to be involved in these discussions.
Yeah, so you've both mentioned assessment, so let's just touch on that quickly. And I think this does kind of link into the question around bandwidth of a curriculum, because let's say maybe you're teaching a particular module or you're involved in the development of a module and its assessment, and you are going through your review process, you're thinking, right, how can I embrace AI, which everyone... And one of the things that we've talked about, I'm not sure if you mentioned this in your workshop, Mike, but I know the traffic light system has been something that people have looked at. So yes, it might be something where you explicitly are asked to use AI and you want screenshots of your prompts and things like that. And it might be a red where you were asked not to do it. So let's say we want to pitch an assessment somewhere on that Likert scale, and you're designing it and thinking about how you're going to introduce it to the students. If there's some element of AI caution or some layer of complexity that goes into the brief, and how you kind of steer the students along in their development of the task that you've given them for this assessment. How do you manage the bandwidth? And this is to both of you, because obviously, Mike, presumably you're designing and delivering your modules, and Paulina, you're working with these module leaders and subject matter experts and kind of helping the students get to grips with these assessments. So this is the key for me. This is an on-the-ground example of bandwidth. How do you keep the focus on these core cognitive skills without getting kind of wrapped up in explaining what the traffic light system is and what the rules and regs are?
Well, maybe I'd like to come in with the traffic light system. In SBS as well, I know that they are trialling AI assessment scales, and the one in particular that's very popular at the moment seems to have worked out or got AI assessment scales to a level that they're mature enough for them to be deployed is Perkins and Rowe. And that's a little bit more sophisticated than the simple traffic light system, which is no, yes, partially. So that's the first element I think that we need in the university, the ability to implement these AI assessment scales, which, as you say, vary from AI is not allowed here to AI is completely free for all. That then gives the tutors, the lecturers, much more freedom to then work and make the assessment the way that they want the assessment to be, the way that they want the assessment to work, what they want the assessment to test, the skills that they need the assessment to develop in the students. Alongside that, there are other aspects too. We need to also ensure that our students know the importance of attribution as well. Now, citation, referencing is crucially important in academics, but it's even more so when we throw AI into the equation too. So, although AI legally isn't considered to be a creator the way that an author is in academia, it's still inputting potentially into our students' work, and they need to understand that they need to attribute that as well, so that on the other side of the coin, the academics can see what has been the students' work, what has not been their work, or how has AI worked, how have they worked with AI. Now, personally speaking, in the longer term, we need our students to work with AI. We need the AI-enhanced humans, because that's what will be happening. That's what the environment they will be working in once they graduate from here. And we have to then develop these skills within our students.
Okay. Paulina, I'll turn to you as well, but I'm interested when you describe that. It sounds good, and I like the way having a framework in there to help give us all a bit of guidance. But does it, at bottom, there's still an issue when you're in class or in one of these sessions with students? It's very easy to find yourself, let's quickly look at the rules around AI use on this, and you can go down a rabbit hole that can take you half an hour out of class time. Do either of you two ever find that, or is this something that's...
Yeah, I think the AI assessment scales now, if we look at them, they are fairly clear-cut and straightforward. The difficulty for academics is to decide what level of AI is appropriate. Speaking personally, I find Gen AI very useful, but then I, and along with most of us who are academics now, learned before Gen AI, so we know the fundamentals. Verification is natural to us, and a lot of the time as well, when we see the output of AI, we can generally see the errors. We can generally notice the bias, although I gave some examples before in some of my workshops where even the hallucinations were so good they caught me out. But the academic skeptics in us force us to go and reference that and cross-check and whatever. Now, these are the skills that if we don't embed in our students, then we run the problem that AI rules or leads the human rather than the human leading or working and being responsible for the AI output. And I think that's the important first thing that we need to ensure, that in our AI literacy, our students have that ability.
Right. Paulina, does that chime with you, or do you find yourself getting caught up in... Do you find the AI aspect of assessment discussions kind of detracting from the core skills? How do you deal with it?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think the arrival of AI and how fast it has changed the landscape of education has really highlighted issues that were always there with assessment design, and that perhaps the universities have been a little slow to adapt to the pace of development and technology. And I think it's a wake-up call, and it would be really good to answer it with well thought out strategy. I feel that often the problem with our assessment can be that we teach to the test, or perhaps the types of assessment that we give the students don't reflect what they will need to do in their jobs. And very often the student's motivation is instrumental. So I need to pass this module, I need to get the degree so that I can get a job. I think one of the purposes of universities in society is to help the students question that approach and to help them love knowledge and learning for what it is. And one of the ways that we can do that is the high stakes side of the education process, which is the assessment. Personally, a lot of my students, if they use AI, I can recognize that they have used it, particularly because many of our students' language level simply, let's say when you speak to a student as opposed to when they submit a written text, the level is completely different. And as a language expert, I can see and I can judge what a student with this kind of level of English is able to produce and what they are not able to produce. But that is, again, coming back to translation software, and obviously there are many tools that perhaps are not or would not be classified as generative AI that the students might have used in the process. I know some module leaders have adopted the approach of giving the students a free rein in using artificial intelligence, as long as the students then reflect and specify how they have used AI in creating their assessment. I think in some ways that is a really interesting approach because it doesn't take the burying your head in the sand approach, pretending that AI is only bad and negative, and it encourages student use of AI in a responsible way. So I think this is a really interesting approach that we can learn something from. But thinking about assessment, there is no way to force students to not cheat. I mean, students have always been really resourceful, but I think we really do have the responsibility to change our assessment so that we can still guarantee the quality of our degrees, so that if a student gets a degree from our university, the employers and everyone else knows what that means and that we have tested the knowledge of that student and we can provide the guarantee that they have learned what they were asked to learn rather than use AI to pretend that they have.
Yeah, okay, I'm going to pick up on that because that's something that I thought, Mike, when you gave your talk, the second of your talks, you had a section on authentic assessment. And I'd like to get both of your views on this because it's something that I struggle with a little bit, because I think just, Paulina, picking up on what you were saying, we really want to test to make sure that we're getting a true picture of students' capabilities, the extent to which they've, learned what the intended learning outcomes were, and just kind of getting an accurate snapshot of someone's abilities and measuring what we're purporting to measure. Do you feel that authenticity in assessment sometimes clouds the ability to do this? Let me add a little bit more context here, because there's an analogy at the moment to closed exams, which I understand. I've heard language about, we don't want to be herding people into exam halls, as if they're livestock, which I would agree. But I think the advantage of something like closed exams is it allows us to isolate particular variables and to really look at what we're measuring for students. So putting them in an environment where they're unaided by digital tools really helps us see what they can do. We obviously want to see what students can do with digital tools as well, and we should look at ways of doing that, but we need to be aware that when we do that, the picture becomes a lot fuzzier. We want to be embracing AI, but when we do that, and other digital tools, the world doesn't begin and end with ChatGPT, but there's a fuzziness to the picture that comes into play when we put students on a task with these tools and then use it as a means of assessment. Do either of you see a tension here? And Mike, you seem to promote the authenticity here, so I'd love to start with you and get your reaction to that.
The first thing I would say about what you said, herding people into exam halls. I have heard that too, and I think I mentioned in the workshop as well the influence of Tesco in Australia. There's been a big, what's the right word for it? A big promotion by Tesco, which I think is the equivalent of QAA here in the UK, about integrity of assessment. And essentially they've come out with a series of recommendations which have ended up being more than guidelines for many of the universities. And my contacts in Australia have said that this is now moving them towards closed book exams. And they have misgivings about this. And what I would say is that just like before Gen AI, assessment has a number of different techniques which we can use, varying from the closed book exams to our project-based, work-based, less sort of confined, constrained assessment techniques. One thing I would say is that with Gen AI, as Paulina said, the speed of the uptake of Gen AI has caused problems, and it has shown some of the stresses in the system with regard to assessment. And what we now have to, I think, realise as academics is that our students are using it, full stop. And we should assume that our students are using it. There's a recent HEPI, which I think is the Higher Education Policy Institute survey that came through, and the 2025 survey compared to the 2024 survey indicated that essentially virtually every single student is using AI in some form now throughout their academic studies, compared to last year, I think it was about 60 or 70% admitted. So this is a significant uptake. So we have to now assume that our students are going to access it or use it. And I think that means we do need to change. And one of the ways I think that we can change more easily, as opposed to having to make a complete and utter break with what we were assessing before, is to use or is to consider authentic assessment as a method where we can integrate AI and we can integrate students' use of AI, because authentic assessment does certain things like it stresses the process, it stresses metacognition, it stresses reflection, and it stresses real-world scenarios too. And these are the kind of things that Gen AI is not so good at. So if we incorporate Gen AI and say Gen AI is taking some of the content knowledge that our students have to apply to an assessment, and we assume that that's been taken care of, then we can assess other things. And by assessing these other things, especially things like the process, then we can look at things like creativity, like analysis, like evaluation, like, as Paulina said earlier, critical thinking, problem solving. And that then, personally as an academic, when I was way before Gen AI, that was the kind of thing that I wanted to test anyway. That was the kind of skills that I wanted my students to develop. And I don't think that's changed now.
So just to rewind a little bit, when you said the AI has been taken care of, so is this like it's a task that's designed to flex critical thinking muscles with the opportunity to use generative AI? However, we're assuming that the training that we've given or the support that we've given in terms of responsible AI use with student is kind of leveling that, controlling for that.
Yes, that's exactly what I was saying. What I would stress, though, is that this is just somewhere along the spectrum of our assessment. There's still the place, for example, in my discipline for programming, for our students to say, for our assessments to say, you cannot use AI, so that we ensure that our computer science students know how to program. Because you can't have a computer science student that doesn't know how to program. But once we're confident that our students know how to program, then perhaps in the second or third year or at master's level, we can set authentic assessments that don't then retest that programming ability. We can assume that they have that, and then we can start testing the problem solving, the critical thinking, the analytical skills.
Paulina, you feeling that's what's your view on the trade-off with authenticity and validity with assessment, if there is one?
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting question. So for example, portfolio assessment, I think is a very good idea, where students, instead of having one big assignment at the end of the semester, have to submit the result of several smaller projects that they work on throughout their learning time. However, particularly at this point in higher education, this brings with it issues of funding and staff workloads, because someone always needs to review and mark and give feedback. We could always think about, the essay. Is it a valid way of evaluating analytical and critical skills of students? And in many ways it is, because those skills will be demonstrated in an essay, be they present or absent. Is an essay an authentic type of assessment? Well, mostly not for most of our students. That's not what most of us will be doing in our careers. I think perhaps the analogy of fitness training might come in helpful. For example, I am a climber, and sometimes I do lots of exercises that will help build my muscles or flexibility, or will enable my tendons to hold for longer on the rock. That doesn't mean that doing, for example, press-ups is not a valid way of improving my climbing skills, because they still strengthen all of the systems in my body that I will need to carry out the authentic climbing the route on the rock. So I think education in some ways doesn't necessarily have to only include authentic assessment. I think it's really important that there's a balance, and that each module leader thinks about what is the best way of preparing the students for the reality in their discipline. And I think that keeps changing, and we need to keep changing with it. And if we want to stay relevant, we really need to be at the forefront. I think closed exams do appear as a solution, and I understand why. In many ways, I am in favor of testing student skills and knowledge and abilities without the support of technology or AI. However, there is a number of issues, for example, being in mental health issues of closed exams. And I think if we do move towards more closed exams, we need to consider that, because there definitely is a mental health crisis, and we can see it in our student population. Ultimately, we want to test students' knowledge rather than how resilient they are against stress or anxiety. I think there are also some issues for students with disabilities. I think there are also other skills that we really need to learn and test and develop in our students, like group communication. And for example, for these, authentic assessments seem much more appropriate than closed exams, I think. So I think it's a really, it's a multifaceted diamond and lots of questions to think about.
A multifaceted diamond. Is that an AI phrase?
I agree with what Paulina said. The thing that I would stress is that authentic assessment isn't the silver bullet. The solution to incorporating and dealing with Gen AI is more of a silver buckshot. There are many different aspects to the solution, one of which is, yes, Gen AI can enable our assessments to embrace Gen AI. However, there's still the place for the closed book exam where Gen AI is not allowed, and the range of things in between. But there are also other aspects in terms of assessment that will contribute to helping deal with the impact of Gen AI. There is, as we've said, AI assessment scales. There is the AI literacy that stresses verification, that stresses attribution. And there is also staff development, because had I not been a computer scientist and not been interested in AI and not done a master's in AI many years ago, Gen AI would have been very difficult for me to cope with, to understand, to incorporate in my learning and teaching and my teaching practice. So we have to enable our staff and our teachers to work with Gen AI, and we have to give them the tools as well to work with this tool.
So let's linger on staff development then. We're running a few sessions here at York. Mike, yours was a great example of a really accessible session which gives people, a base level knowledge. There's a lot of discussion and getting on board, just getting stuck into tools. We were thinking about assessments. We're collaborating with colleagues. It's kind of like, is everything a training session should need, but these sessions are often voluntary, they're attended by people who are interested in the subject. How do we get training done at a blanket level and make sure that people aren't getting left behind? There are people who will say, they'll start with the bit that you started this conversation with. Well, the cognitive skills that students need haven't changed, so I'm going to carry on, and this doesn't really apply to me. And the gap between those who are taking charge of this and those who are just concerned with their own subject specialism kind of grows. How do we address that? And what is an appropriate level of AI awareness or digital skills awareness generally that you think teachers need, and really any staff involved in provision of learning and teaching?
If I can offer my perspective first, I think one of the advantages of Mike's approach in his workshops is that it is extremely non-threatening. And I think there's a lot of fear around AI. Some of it is perhaps based in real facts. AI is going to bring change, and it might threaten some people's jobs, but I don't think AI, and Mike might correct me later, but I don't think AI is going to replace people. The people who are going to be left behind are going to be those who don't adapt. So I think our jobs will change rather than disappear. Phil, you really hit the nail on the head when you said there will definitely be academics who will not want to embrace AI. And I think sometimes it's a question of time, with any new tech invention, there are always the early adopters, and then the curve continues until the majority adopt the technology. And then I think the people who weren't as keen at the start might probably join because they will start feeling that they are being left behind. So I think there is definitely an emotional aspect to staff training. And I think academic autonomy is really important to consider. And you can't force anyone to use AI. But I think it's really important for people to be able to see the advantages and also to put the students at the center. What do we need to teach the students so that they can thrive, so that they can address the global sustainability development goals? How do we prepare the students for challenges which we don't even know what they are at this point? I think that needs to be one of the crucial elements when we think about what is required of staff and how staff are trained.
Yes, 100% agree with Paulina, especially when she talked about the fear and early adopters, those kind of things. Perhaps if I sort of think about it in a different way and look at another technology that we as academics had to deal with, and that's the VLE. I remember 25 years ago when VLEs first came in. I was an early adopter then, but that's because I like this kind of thing. And there were many staff who really didn't want anything to do with it. They thought that the VLE was going to take their role away, that VLEs were going to replace academics and teachers. And we've seen now, 25 years later, that's not been the case. The adoption of VLE was very slow. It was very sporadic. Some staff embraced it and taught themselves and learned about how to incorporate video and implement online pedagogies into a hybrid kind of environment. And then COVID hit. And all of a sudden, everybody had to work with the VLE. And not only that, we had to learn new technologies like Google Meet, like Microsoft Teams, like cloud computing, to be able to do our teaching. And funnily enough, everybody got it. People now use VLEs as a natural part of their teaching. And I suspect with Gen AI, it will certainly need to be done in a much shorter timescale, but we're going to see the same things. The issue then with COVID-19 was that it made many people realize the advantages of working with VLEs, the affordances it gave. And not only that, but then we had the support from the universities to help us with understanding how pedagogies worked. And I think the same process needs to happen for us with Gen AI. One of the things that I think is lacking at the moment are the guidelines for staff. We are still not sure how we can apply Gen AI, what the limitations are, how to deal with what could be considered to be plagiarism, what may not be considered to be plagiarism under a new environment. So I think the first thing, as Paulina said right at the very start, is that we need to have more university guidelines. Once we've got that in place, then the playing field becomes known. The environment, the context within which we as academics, teachers and researchers too, and professional staff as well, within which we are operating with regards to Gen AI becomes clearer. And once that's the first step, then people will then start, oh, I need to know this, or I could improve that, or here, this is an affordance, this is an advantage for me when I'm trying to do this, that, and the other. But when we don't know the environment within which we are operating, it becomes unclear, and therefore there's a fear associated with it as well.
Yeah, I mean, the guidelines, I think they're a great starting point. A couple of things first of all, we want to try and get guidelines off of the PDF and into mainstream conversations, right? I think that's kind of the challenge. I think we feel very pleased when there's some text available that we can anchor our thinking to, sometimes especially around false authorship and what do we do in these situations. But isn't there a bit of a difficulty with the situation we're in at the moment? It's kind of, don't get me started on the VLE. Oh, that's a separate podcast. But it's a bit different because we've got because of the pace of change and the amount of areas that this impacts. We've got pretty much every aspect of teaching, learning, and assessment on a scale that we didn't really see with Zoom or with the VLE. And also it's the pace of change. So I think guidelines are great, but they are static. Yes, you can update them every now and again, but one thing I've run into here is the limitations of static resources around Gen AI because they have such a short shelf life. I'm trying to I'm sort of trying to deliver a course for students at the moment and trying to get materials together and thinking of what I ran a staff training session last year and everything I put on there is now out of date and I've got to redo it all. So it's a different kettle of fish with Gen AI in terms of training. It's more of a thorny issue. Do you think, I mean, you mentioned COVID earlier. Do you feel like we need an emergency? I'm not saying we need another COVID, but we need some sense of urgency perhaps to bring people into training who wouldn't normally. How do you reach those people who would, much like they avoid the VLE, will avoid this?
That's a very tough question, and I don't have a simple answer for it. What I would say, though, is that, yes, the speed of Gen AI and the sheer scale of the disruption to learning and teaching has been dramatic. Nothing like we saw with VLE at all. However, we still have to respond to it. And I think a lot of the problem is that we still don't really know what environment we're working with. And if we start putting those bricks in place, that I think is the first step. Because at the moment we can have arguments about, how do we change our pedagogy? Does it change our teaching paradigm? And there are plenty of people having that discussion. But unless we know at the moment what we're dealing with here with our own individual teaching, that is in the distance. We need to get there eventually. We need to talk about post-plagiarism world. We need to talk about things like generativism as a potential pedagogy to work alongside constructivism and things like that. But firstly, we need to actually know, how do I deal with it on the ground?
Well, I might offer my own experience perhaps as someone who is generally suspicious of technology, even though I use it every day quite proficiently in my job. I think one of the things that are really important for me, for my well-being and general human thriving, is to set boundaries and to spend protected time away from all technology. I think that is really important to keep in mind. So that is kind of where I'm partly coming from. But what really helped me was a free workshop where someone just showed me really practical ways of how I can write or create prompts for ChatGPT and get some results. So, very practical extremely useful. I could put it into practice immediately, and that was my first sort of encounter. It really helped me overcome a lot of the fears and reservations I had around AI, and there was no obligation for me to engage with it any further. I just found that really helpful for myself.
I guess there's a lot of things we could touch on now. I'm just trying to think. With the original question was touched on whose remit should this be. I think there is an awareness that we all, staff, students, everyone involved in education, administration, or whatever your role is, we all contribute, and an awareness to what's going on with these tools, how the landscape is changing, how the technology impacts us. Teaching and learning is all important. But do you have any feelings either way as to who should be responsible for teaching students how to use these tools? We could have subject lecturers kind of trying to weave it into the delivery of their modules on political science, or we could have bolt-on modules that talk to students about their assessments and make explicit links, or something else entirely. So what do you see as not an answer to this question, but perhaps a direction this could go in?
Well, we did talk about AI literacy right at the very start, didn't we? And I think that an important support for the integration of Gen AI into our both staff and students is AI literacy. And I think there is a debate to be had whether we need to have an AI literacy program alongside our digital literacy, or whether we need to have an AI program that's incorporated in or maybe even replaces digital literacy. I'm not sure, how it would work, but there definitely is a need for an AI literacy program, both for staff and students. In my opinion, I think it needs to be carried out for staff first, because the staff are essentially going to be, if not teaching, then certainly being responsible for the students' application of that AI literacy within their studies. And I think we've mentioned some of the things that AI literacy should encompass, and that is what the tools do, how to use the tools, like Paulina said, prompt engineering for Gen AI, the skills of how to use them effectively, like verification, attribution, and also then finally areas such as the ethical use of it. Now, those are the same for staff and students. The fundamentals are. There might be differences in that. In staff AI literacy training, we're focusing more on how to design assessments to be, if not AI friendly, then certainly incorporate them. And there would be an emphasis on the integrity of our assessments in the age of AI. But with the students as well, there are the same kind of things, but it's also, right, how do you ensure that your assessment fits within our university plagiarism guidelines? How do you ensure that you demonstrate what you've done so that you can show that you have used AI within the guidelines set? I hope one of the answers to what you were thinking is that we do need to look at very soon developing AI literacy and incorporating it for both staff and students.
Any ideas about who should run it?
That's above my pay grade.
Yeah, I can definitely imagine the sort of training that all staff and I imagine students now receive on things like fire safety or academic integrity or how to use the library. And just another type of training would be, basic artificial intelligence literacy. Certainly I can see among the cohorts of students I teach that they are using technology all the time, but their level of digital literacy is extremely low. And I would imagine that would extend for many of these students to artificial intelligence literacy as well. And yeah, I think it is above our pay grade, and it definitely needs to be a whole university approach, or at least a particular faculty approach, because perhaps using AI would look very differently in learning and teaching based on what subjects you are teaching. Sorry, I don't think that answers your question.
No, but I don't think you should. You're both saying it's above your pay grade, but I think you're doing yourselves a disservice. I mean, you guys are both on the ground with this, and it's not to say I don't think. Yeah, I know what you mean about the responsibility should come from above, especially as Paulina, you've talked about resource allocation. We've also got to bear in mind there are people on the ground with real expertise in this. You both have experience seeing how students react to assessments and the conditions that we set to make, we make our own adaptations to try and embrace AI and all these other digital skills, and we can see how students are reacting and taking to it. So I think there's, I hope what you mean by it's above my playground isn't to say that you shouldn't be involved in the conversation, because I think it's got to be a bit more holistic than.
Maybe I was being a bit flippant there, Phil, and maybe I perhaps would turn the question back to you, because in your department as well, you have the remit for this. And I think, I was certainly surprised just now when Paulina said, she was surprised at the low level of digital literacy. That was a surprise for me, because digital literacy in terms of university programs has been going on for a very, very long time now. And for our students still to have low levels of digital literacy, or levels of digital literacy that we don't think are adequate, means that perhaps the way that we have been teaching it isn't fit for what we need it to be. And perhaps then, once again, Gen AI being disruptive, it might need a rethink about how do we do this? Do we actually then start incorporating some of these soft and I'm not sure whether they're soft skills, but these non-subject specific skills actually into the degree and making it a requirement to do certain things? Or do we continue with making them run alongside or parallel with our degrees? And then if we do that and they're not working, then we need to think, well, how do we incentivize our students to do this? And that might simply be highlighting the importance to their studies, or it might need something else. But then I'm one side of the fence. The likes of the two of you who are dealing with this on a more day-to-day basis perhaps could contribute much more to the debate, because you're seeing it on the ground as opposed to and trying to implement these things, whereas I'm sort of working alongside my day job, if you like.
Out of interest, what do you class as being the primary digital skills students need, and pulling similarly, because you...
Yeah, I mean, for me, the extreme case would be I start a lesson and I ask the students to go to the corresponding VLE site and to open the slides on their devices so that they can follow what we are doing. And 15 minutes later, some students still haven't even managed to find the correct course on the VLE. It's also basic things like writing an email with an appropriate tone of voice, knowing where to search for and find information. I think really basic things.
Yeah, I would agree. I'm continually surprised with my students who are doing their dissertations when I'm working in my supervision meetings, and the first thing they're doing is they're not thinking beyond Google Scholar for looking for their references. They're not aware of the university's libraries, the database. That's a surprise to me continually. Yeah. Not all students, many of them, the vast majority of them are great, but I'm still surprised that when you get to third year, they still don't know that you look beyond Google Scholar, you look beyond simple search engines when you're looking for academic references.
Oh, some of mine even get to Google Scholar. I'm happy with that. The one thing I've noticed about running an AI literacies course, where so many of the packages that we're trying to make them aware of are not university supported. We have a couple. We have Copilot and Gemini, and most unis have some equivalent. But we're also trying to give them a broad awareness of these. There's this myriad of unsupported apps, which it's useful to at least know what they do. But trying to navigate this in class, to get students logged on to anything, even university systems, can eat up 10, 15 minutes of class time at the best of times. When you're dealing with something like Runway or, media-based AI packages where access is patchy and, it's down today, sorry, we're not dealing with free users today. This is a big problem. I'm not sure whether it's a digital skills thing or just a reality of running a digital kind of hands-on class, which they kind of need to be, I guess. I think it is incredibly tough to run these training courses and to know exactly what. I mean, one of the things that I've found is knowing where the boundaries are. What is an appropriate level of knowledge? What do students really need to know? Where is it useful to push these classes up to? Do they need to know about text to audio generation and the copyright debates around that? Is this something that's relevant or useful?
I think there's a basic base level of knowledge. Perhaps not in terms of what you've just talked about, but certainly students need to know about IP, and they need to know, for example, that if you're using a tool with a certain type of license compared to one, say, Gemini or Copilot, which we're using at the university, with the university license, which means, and what that means, so with the university, it means that what you put in doesn't go outside of the university into the Gen AI software's training database. Whereas if you use it outside, it does. And so that means that that's almost like sharing your work, or indeed someone else's work who may not have been given permission for that, with the whole world.
Yeah.
So they need to know that. They need to know certain basics. They need to know what it means if a lecturer says this type of AI only is used or is permitted to be used. So there is a very base level of knowledge that they need. And then it's up to us, I think, in our own individual subjects, what we add on. But there certainly is a minimum level. Quite what that is yet, I think we still need to find out. We know in certain areas what it would be. We know that you have to verify. We know that you have to attribute. But how much students have to attribute, that's something we've still got to find out. But I don't think there's too much we need to know more about that. But in other areas there is. But I think that will shake out in the next, in the short period of time once we start doing it.
Nice. Okay. All right. More on staff and student training to come in the meantime. Thanks very much, Mike and Paulina.
Thanks for having us.
Yes, thank you for inviting me, Phil. I've enjoyed it. I've enjoyed talking about AI.
Always do. Lovely. All right, guys. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks. Bye-bye.
Bye.